One of the most significant moments in the story of Jesus, as told in the New Testament, is also one of the biggest hurdles for skeptics and non-believers: his birth to a virgin named Mary. But while the idea of a woman becoming pregnant without a male partner goes against everything we know about science and biology today, it was once a powerful advantage in spreading the Christian message. Since many of the greatest heroes of Greco-Roman history and legend had similarly been born of a human mother and a divine father. Today, our society no longer believes in the ancient Greek myths of gods and demigods. Accordingly, many people, even devout Christians, are disposed to regard the nativity stories of Luke and Matthew as pious myths, as legends that grew in the telling, or as allegories to express Christ's uniqueness. The gradual development of the virgin birth story is strongly supported by the fact that our earliest Christian writings, such as the epistles of Paul and the Gospel of Mark, show no awareness of it. At the same time, Christian media and the religious publishing industry are dominated by apologists who not only insist that the virgin birth story is 100% true, but who also downplay or even deny any connection between the conception and birth of Jesus and the countless myths of other divine births that preceded the Gospels. The idea that part of the nativity story was borrowed from pagan writers is considered embarrassing and must be refuted at all costs, even at the cost of the truth. The truth is what you're here for, isn't it? At MythVision, we look for the truth wherever it may be found. We talk to experts, we review the evidence, and we present it to you so you can make up your own mind. Consider the words of Justin Martyr, a 2nd century theologian who was active at a time when the Gospels were first being circulated. Unlike today's apologists, he believed that the similarities between the birth of Jesus and the divine births of other pagan heroes added to the credibility of the Christ story. In his first apology, he wrote, "In asserting that Jesus Christ, our teacher, who is the firstborn of God, was born without sexual intercourse, we present nothing new compared to those whom you call sons of Zeus, for you know how many sons your revered historians ascribe to Zeus. Hermes, the hermeneutic logos and teacher of all. Asclepius, who was also a healer and after being struck by lightning, ascended into heaven. As did Dionysus, who was torn in pieces. Heracles, who to escape his torments threw himself into the fire. The Dioscuri, born of Leda, and Perseus, born of Danae. And if we also say that he, in an unusual way compared to an ordinary birth, was born from God as the Logos of God, it should be ordinary to you, since you call Hermes the premonitory Logos that proceeds from God. And if we also present him as being born through a virgin, it should be as ordinary to you as that pertaining to Perseus." There you have it, from one of Christianity's earliest and most famous theologians. The birth of Jesus presents nothing new. But you don't have to take Justin's word for you to believe it. You can examine the evidence for yourself. In this video, we will discuss some of the claims of divine births found in Greek, Egyptian, and even Jewish writings prior to the birth of Jesus. We will examine their similarities and differences, and we will consider why these stories were important to people. We will also look at how Jesus' divine conception is described in the Gospels, and how that relates to ancient misconceptions about embryology. Then you can make up your own mind on whether the Nativity story is a unique and divinely inspired narrative, or a story indebted to the myths and legends that came before it. Given how utterly dependent the nativity stories of Matthew and Luke are upon earlier Jewish scriptures and story motifs, a fact that is mainstream knowledge among Bible scholars, including pious Christian academics, is it really so surprising that the divine conception of Jesus could also be inspired by earlier legends and stories? Within the canonical New Testament, only 2 books mention the birth of Jesus: the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. These 2 books contradict each other so much that they are essentially telling different nativity stories. But one of the few points of agreement is that Mary becomes pregnant through some divine act of God, rather than through normal relations with Joseph, her husband-to-be. Both nativity stories are composed almost entirely out of Old Testament parallels and highly stereotyped formulas. Matthew has rich allusions to the Moses story and to Balaam's oracle about the star in the book of Numbers, and he incorporates 5 Old Testament quotations as prophecies he claims are fulfilled by the birth of Jesus. The most significant of these quotations is Isaiah 7:14, an ancient oracle that was originally addressed to King Ahaz of Judah. Matthew specifically quotes the Greek Septuagint translation for its convenient use of the Greek word parthenos, meaning virgin. Reams of literature have been published on the semantic range of parthenos. The point here is to show that Matthew's story is almost entirely composed out of pre-existing stories and literary material. Whatever he is doing, he is not writing history. It's the same with Luke's nativity story. His version borrows heavily from divine birth stories in the Old Testament, particularly the angelic annunciation stories of Hagar in Genesis 16, of Samson's mother in the book of Judges and in Pseudo-Philo, and of Sarah in Genesis 18. The angel Gabriel is borrowed from the book of Daniel, and one can also find allusions to the Psalms, Isaiah, Malachi, Sirach, and Judith. Like Matthew's story, Luke's story is implausible on historical grounds. It is an exercise in myth-building that is composed largely of pre-existing traditions and literary references that originally had nothing to do with Jesus. When it comes to Jesus' birth, both Matthew and Luke are quite coy about specifics. Matthew says that before Mary and Joseph started living together, Mary was found to be with child from a Holy Spirit, Matthew 1:18. It's important to understand that this divine spirit is not the third person of the Trinity, a doctrine that was not defined until centuries later. The word pneuma, translated spirit, literally means wind, and it often describes the power of God in the Old Testament. In Luke, Mary is greeted by the angel Gabriel and told she will conceive in her womb and bear a son. This prediction in itself is hardly unusual, since Mary is about to get married. However, the narrator has Mary show surprise and declare her virginity to Gabriel, who then explains that a divine pneuma, a holy wind, will come upon her and overshadow her. Gabriel also explains that a similar miracle from God has caused Mary's cousin Elizabeth, who is elderly and barren, to bear a son as well. Scholars have long noted how vague Matthew and Luke are about the nature of Mary's pregnancy. It is only in Luke where Mary is described as a virgin. For Matthew, what is miraculous about the birth of Jesus is the way it fulfills Jewish prophecy. The role of the divine pneuma is only revealed to Joseph in a dream, so he will go through with his marriage to Mary. As Robert J. Miller observes in his book on the Nativity stories, Matthew does not use the virginal conception as a basis for making any theological or Christological point at all. In fact, he never mentions or even alludes to it elsewhere in his gospel, not even in the rest of the infancy narrative. In that light, the modern focus on the phrase virgin birth is quite misleading. The whole point of both nativity stories, despite how different they are from each other, is to show that Jesus is the Son of God rather than a human male. This is important because it means that the woman doesn't have to be a virgin in order for a divine birth legend to be relevant to the Jesus story. As the late Catholic theologian Uta Ranka Heinemann noted in her book, Putting Away Childish Things, the narratives of the virgin birth in pagan antiquity and the two in Matthew and Luke are not about the chastity of the mother, but the splendor of the Son. They aim to glorify the Son, not the virginity of his mother. Given how utterly dependent the nativity stories of Matthew and Luke are upon earlier Jewish scriptures and story motifs, a fact that is mainstream knowledge among Bible scholars, including pious Christian academics, is it really so surprising that the divine conception of Jesus could also be inspired by earlier legends and stories? Stories about Greek and Roman heroes with divine parentage were fairly diverse. Some of the characters in these stories were purely mythical, while others were real historical individuals of the recent past. Some involved literal intercourse between a human woman and a god, while in other cases the conception took place through indirect methods. Many of these birth stories also contain other motifs that appear in the Gospel nativity stories: dream portents, astrological signs, proclamations of the newborn child's greatness, attempts on the child's life, the child being hidden and rescued from harm, and so on. However, we'll mainly concern ourselves with the miraculous conceptions. These examples are compiled from a variety of modern reference works, particularly the ones shown here. Heracles. Nearly everyone has heard of Heracles or Hercules, a popular character who headlined a variety of popular ancient tales. According to his birth legend, the god Zeus disguised himself as the husband of a woman named Alcmene, while her real husband was away on a military expedition. Zeus lay with her for 3 nights so that she would give birth to his son, Heracles. Having Zeus as his father marked Heracles as a great ruler and the most powerful of the ancient Greek heroes. Perseus. Before the time of Heracles, the greatest hero and monster slayer of Greek myth was Perseus. According to his birth legend, his mother was a princess named Danae, the only child of King Acrisius of Argos. King Acrisius had been told by the Oracle of Delphi that he would die at the hands of his grandson, so to prevent Danae from having children, he locked her in an underground chamber. However, Zeus came down in the form of golden rain that streamed into her chamber and caused Danae to become pregnant. Soon after, Perseus was born. Pythagoras. Pythagoras of Samos was a famous Greek philosopher and polymath of the 6th century BC. According to the biography of Pythagoras, written by Iamblichus, the philosophy of Pythagoras was so far beyond human capacities that people believed him to have been the son of Apollo, who had impregnated his mother as a fulfillment of prophecy. Iamblichus himself did not believe in this legend, but he thought that the soul of Pythagoras had originated as a companion of the god Apollo in the heavens. Plato, the great Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC, was also said to have been the son of Apollo. According to several historians and biographers, Apollo came to the husband of a woman named Perictione in a dream, telling him to have no intercourse with her until she had borne a child. Sometime later, the child Plato was miraculously born on the very birthday of Apollo himself. According to the historian Apuleius, Plato's divine birth was evidence of his great virtue and powers, which were equivalent to those of the gods. Alexander the Great. There were stories circulating while Alexander was still alive that his mother Olympias had been visited by Zeus himself, either as a thunderbolt or in the form of a snake, before she consummated her marriage to Philip. There was also a story told by several historians in which Alexander made a detour to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis during his campaign in Egypt. When he reached the temple, the high priest greeted him as the son of Zeus. During his visit, Alexander was told that he would conquer the world and never be defeated. Afterward, Alexander ordered his subjects to call him the son of Zeus and demanded that he be worshipped. Augustus Caesar. According to the birth stories of Augustus told by the historians Dio Cassius and Suetonius, Gaius Octavius, the eventual first emperor of Rome, was born to a woman named Attia. One day she fell asleep at the temple of Apollo, and depending on the story, she either dreamt of having intercourse with a snake or was actually visited by a snake. In either case, she believed the snake to have been a manifestation of Apollo. She soon found herself pregnant and had another dream in which her womb was carried up to the stars and spread over all lands and seas. 9 months after her snake encounter, she gave birth to Octavius, who was considered to be the son of Apollo. Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius was a 1st century philosopher and wandering sage, a contemporary of Jesus from Cappadocia, who traveled throughout the Middle East and other lands. According to the biography of Apollonius, written by Philostratus, his mother was visited by an apparition of the god Proteus, who told her she would conceive and bear a divine child. In fact, that child was to be an incarnation of Proteus himself. When the time of the birth arrived, she was told in a dream to visit a meadow. She fell asleep in the grass, and the wild swans in the meadow all cried out at once, causing her to give birth. Philostratus also mentions that some considered Apollonius to be the son of Zeus due to a thunderbolt that had accompanied his birth. Philostratus relates the story of Apollonius with ambiguity as to whether his birth story should be understood literally or as a spiritual allegory. Many other aspects of Apollonius's life, such as his ascension to heaven, find parallels in the life of Christ in the Gospels. Although Philostratus was writing in the early 200s, he reportedly relied on the memoirs of Damas, a companion of Apollonius. If Damas actually existed, this would date the birth legend to around the same time that Matthew and Luke were written. It is impossible to say which legend came first, but it shows that divine birth stories were being told about individuals similar to Jesus and at around the same time. Ion. Ion is an obscure god, but his parallels with Jesus are some of the most interesting. According to the church father Epiphanius, Ion was born to the virgin Persephone, also called Cori, and this birth was celebrated each year in Alexandria, Egypt on January 6th, the same day that the winter solstice and lengthening of the days was observed. Other scholars have identified similar festivals in Petra and Elusa. Historian Marguerite Rigoglioso believes this celebration originated with the Eleusinian rituals about the Virgin Mother Goddess involving the Greek concept of the aion, which referred to epochs or generations of time in Greek philosophy and was tremendously important in Gnostic Christianity. Furthermore, the Nile River was believed to possess special powers the night before this celebration, and that may have been the reason the Gnostic followers of Basilides celebrated Christ's baptism on January 6th, an event that became the Christian festival of Epiphany. These examples show that an encounter between a god and a human woman to produce a divine child could take any number of forms. Sometimes physical copulation was imagined, but other times the impregnation took more intangible forms: magical rain, dreams, and apparitions. The parallels do not have to be exact for us to recognize the similarities. No reasonable person would argue that the birth of Apollonius, for example, was an entirely independent story and a reliable fact of history just because it contained details that were unique to him. Every divine birth story is unique, and the most important thing in every instance is the divine destiny of the child that is produced. According to Adele Yarborough Collins and John J. Collins, in their book King and Messiah as Son of God, Matthew and Luke are both evoking these legends of the births of famous Greek and Roman men in their nativity stories. Matthew, for example, chose the passage in Isaiah about a virgin giving birth because he knew it would remind readers of similar stories. Regarding the differences between Matthew's nativity story and other myths, Collins say, "There is no exact or even very close parallel to Matthew's story in Greek and Latin literature for two reasons. First, the story is analogous to and probably inspired by Greek and Roman stories, but the typical form of the story is adapted to a Jewish context. Second, like some Greeks and others roughly contemporary with Matthew, the evangelist rejected the mythological expression of the idea. In other words, the influence and motifs of Greco-Roman birth legends are obvious in Matthew and Luke, but they have been adapted to Jewish cultural beliefs and demythologized. The aversion to physical impregnation in their divine birth stories is not unique to Matthew and Luke. Plutarch, for example, writes in Life of Numa that according to the Egyptians, gods could not have carnal intercourse with human women, but they could approach them through a divine pneuma and make them pregnant. Collins and Collins are quick to note that Plutarch uses the same word pneuma that is used by Matthew and Luke. And speaking of the Egyptians, the influences on early Christianity and the nativity stories don't end with Greco-Roman myths. Egyptian religion and mythology were highly regarded during the Hellenistic and Roman eras due to their great antiquity, and Roman culture was thoroughly permeated by Egyptian religion, including the cults of Isis, Osiris, Serapis, and Harpocrates, as well as Hermeticism. There are two Egyptian divine birth myths in particular that might have influenced the Christian nativity stories. From the late period to the Greco-Roman period, Egyptian temples often had an attached chapel called mamisi, or birth house, where the birth and coronation of the divine child of the local god would be reenacted during annual ceremonies and other rituals. Some of these surviving chapels feature iconography and wall inscriptions that describe birth legends, much like the birth of Christ. The story told by these images and texts is more or less the same at each location. The earthly queen is divinely impregnated by the spirit of a god and then gives birth to the future king. Whenever a royal child grew up and became the new pharaoh of Egypt, he was taking on the divine role of the god Horus. Different versions of this story exist in connection with several historical pharaohs, including Hatshepsut, Amenophis III, and Ramesses II. In one instance, the god Amun greets the newborn Amenophis with the proclamation, "My natural son, whom I have begotten," which is quite similar to the formulation given in the Gospels at the baptism of Jesus, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I rejoice." The birth legend of the god Horus is attested in a wide variety of sources, from Old Kingdom pyramid texts and later coffin text to the Hellenistic Metternich stele and the inscription at the temple in Edfu. It is remarkable for its many similarities to both the Gospel nativity stories and the story of Moses in the Bible. An in-depth description of Horus's nativity, as described in these texts, is provided by historian Thomas Schneider in a 2004 paper, but the highlights are as follows. The means of Horus's conception varies. Often, it is depicted passively, with Isis taking the form of a bird of prey and hovering over the dead Osiris, or sitting on his phallus. In the coffin text, however, Isis is often described as a virgin and is impregnated by a meteor or comet. Isis then announces to the world that the seed of Osiris is carried in her womb. Isis travels to the marshes of Chemish, where she gives birth to the divine child. The birth of Horus is received with rejoicing by the gods and the people, reminding us of the heavenly hosts, proclaiming the divine birth in Luke's Gospel. The occasion is marked by the miraculous shining of the sun in the middle of the night. This portent awakens Seth, the tyrant who is ruling Egypt in Osiris' stead. His advisors inform him of the significance of the sun's unexpected appearance. A divine child has been born, and he will avenge his father by ending Seth's reign. Hearing this, Seth seeks to kill Horus, but Thoth, the god of wisdom, warns Isis of the danger. Isis and the child flee to a remote oasis to hide from Seth. Seth, meanwhile, spends years searching the marshes for Horus. Schneider argues that the nativity stories of Christ are directly dependent on the Horus birth myth. The religions of Isis and Osiris were widespread in the Hellenistic Roman world, so people throughout the Mediterranean would have been familiar with it. And there were also close contacts between Jewish communities in Egypt and elsewhere. Another scholar, E. Blumenthal, argues that the reliance of the Nativity Gospels on Egyptian myth can be accepted even without a direct link, because the Horus myth had been so thoroughly absorbed and preserved in various forms by other Greco-Roman legends of divine men by the time Christianity came around. More direct evidence that Jewish intellectuals knew about the Horus myth might be found in an often overlooked Jewish text from the early 1st century called The Life of Jeremiah. It states at one point that the priests in Egypt worship a virgin giving birth to an infant who is placed in a manger and worshipped. Schneider believes that this remark describes the ritual performance of the birth of Horus that was performed at the aforementioned Mamisi chapels. This text and the Horus ritual itself might have influenced pre-Christian beliefs about the Jewish Messiah, providing a missing link between Egyptian mythology and the Christian nativity stories. Examples of divine birth legends that parallel the Christian nativity story aren't limited to so-called pagan sources, because impregnation through a divine act of God was recognized even in Judaism. Philo of Alexandria, a well-known Jewish philosopher and theologian of the 1st century, taught in his tractate on the cherubim that the most virtuous women of the Bible, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Zipporah, had conceived through God rather than through relations with their husbands. He says the seed in them was sown by the Father of the universe, the uncreated God, he who is the parent of all things. He further goes on to explain that Sarah conceived Isaac when she was in solitude with God, even though that child was for Abraham. Philo also cites Genesis 29:31, and God opened her womb, as evidence that God planted divine seed in Leah so she could produce sons for Jacob. In another text titled On the Change of Names, Philo reiterates that Leah's womb was opened so as to receive the seed of divine generation. Philo also argued that both Rebecca and Zipporah were directly impregnated by God. Regarding Zipporah, Moses' wife, Philo says, Zipporah found that she conceived by no mortal man. Elsewhere, Philo describes Sarah as becoming pregnant by seeds of heaven, so that it is God who is Isaac's true father. On that basis, Philip Siegel argues in his paper, Further Reflections on the Begotten Messiah, that none of the ideas about Jesus being the Messiah born of a divine birth are original or unique to Judaism. All that is new in the Gospels is their application to Jesus. In his commentary on Luke, François Bovon acknowledges the complex mix of Egyptian, Greek, and Jewish ideas that influenced the Nativity story. The legend of the Annunciation developed in Hellenistic Jewish milieu, in which Christians were interested in the origin of the Messiah and wanted to retain his divine generation, his true sonship, and the virgin birth in one narrative unit. Theologically, they were influenced by Egyptian Hellenistic Judaism, which in turn also depended on Egyptian concepts. The story of Mary conceiving a child through the divine pneuma or wind of God is based not only on ubiquitous myths of divine births, but also on how the ancients misunderstood science, embryology to be specific. Thanks to modern science, we understand today that reproduction requires genetic contributions from two parents. All human beings have two pairs of chromosomes, one from the mother's ovum and one from the father's sperm. Unlike us, the ancient Greeks and Romans did not understand genetics. No one on Earth even knew that the ovum existed until a physician named K.E. von Baer discovered it in 1827. Although ancient intellectuals had a variety of theories about embryology, the most widespread view was that propounded by Aristotle. This theory, known as epigenesis, held that the woman was a passive container who simply protected the fetus and provided it with material needed to grow into a baby. The active ingredient that actually became a fetus was the sperma of the male. This is reflected in the metaphors used to describe procreation. The male provides the seed, and the woman provides the fertile womb in which it grows. Women who cannot have children are described as barren, like a field without crops. This view held sway all the way from the time of Aristotle up until the 16th century. It's no accident that the Gospels describe Mary as becoming pregnant from God's pneuma. The concepts of pneuma, wind, and sperma, seed, were closely related in ancient medicine. Far from being simply spiritual matter, pneuma was the very real substance that animated the body, being found in the blood and the nerves. Semen itself was believed to be a form of blood produced only by men. This presents a problem for the nativity stories. because they assume the Aristotelian view of childbirth. For God to blow his divine pneuma into a young maiden in order to produce a divine child makes good sense if you think the woman is a passive vessel in the process of reproduction. But it's nonsense in terms of real biology. A modern reader is forced to wonder if God implanted physical sperm that combined with Mary's own genetic material in her ovum. If so, that simply means the child is a human, not a god. Furthermore, it implies an unsettling level of sexual interaction that is ultimately pointless. Uda Renke Hinnemann concludes, "The idea of a concerted action between God and a woman was obviously not what Matthew and Luke had in mind when they told their stories of the virgin birth. That would have meant a sexual relationship of God with a woman. And even if this wasn't exactly the same thing as sexual relations between a man and a woman, it would have been uncomfortably similar. Thus, if people had known about a woman's ovum back then, they would have had to reject it as part of the incarnation just as much as they did a man's semen. Both ovum and semen destroy the basic idea behind the biological virgin birth, with God in charge of everything. Thus, ignorance served as the foundation for the idea of a virgin birth from the Holy Spirit, in a sex-free domain. After the discovery of the ovum, any further claim that Mary gave birth virginally reduces God's role to that of a mere male substitute. The doctrine of the virgin birth, in a biological sense, locks the Church into insoluble theological problems, assuming it wishes to take the facts of gynecology into consideration. But on this subject, the Church still follows Aristotle, because if it acknowledged the existence of the ovum, then it would have only two choices: either change the creed to read 50% conceived by the Holy Spirit, or should the Church continue to deny Mary an ovum, then she becomes not Jesus' mother, but his foster mother, or, to put it crudely, a rented womb. Though apologists may tell you otherwise, the fact that the gospel nativity stories are literary inventions inspired by other myths and legends of divine kings and heroes is not really controversial in the fields of theology and biblical studies. In 1929, almost a century ago, the standard Protestant reference work, Religion in Geschichte und Gegenwart, stated the following: "The most varying cycles of myths and legends tells of sons of the gods who are born of the union with an earthly woman. According to ancient Egyptian tradition, Amun-Ra begets with the king's consort, the divine child, who will exercise a splendid royal power throughout the land. Babylonian kings, Greek heroes, Heracles, Asclepius among others, and Roman emperors were all begotten by gods. Greek religion laid special stress on the virginity of the mother impregnated by the god, and the birth legend of Jesus must likewise be put into this historical religious context. Even though the earliest Christian texts say nothing about a virgin birth, inventing one was a critical step in spreading the faith. On this point, the late Catholic theologian Carl Adam wrote, "The myth of the supernatural begetting of preeminent mythically transfigured personalities is no doubt so deeply rooted that at least within the Hellenistic world, pious believers would not have been able to bear a purely natural origin of a cultic being. The doctrine of the virgin birth is no longer capable of fulfilling the same purpose it did in the early Christian era. We know all those ancient stories of kings and heroes being born from divine fathers are fiction. We know that women are not impregnated by divine wind. The virgin birth has gone from being a powerful testimony to a stumbling block. The belief of today's Christians in the divinity of Jesus is not a secondary belief based on the realization that Mary was a virgin when she conceived her child. It's now the other way around. People only accept the virgin birth story because they already believe Jesus was divine.